Hello everyone and welcome to another News Coolum video and another plug side chat. And it's not quite an interactive plug side chat, but I am going to be kind of reading your comments to try to figure out on the upcoming Chevy Bolt, because we do have more information that's been released, but kind of not really. And then also just some people have pushed back on one of my assumptions, and so now I'm just trying to do a sanity check. So, in terms of the new information, and if anybody can find the link to this, please send it my way, because apparently GM CEO Mary Barra, in an interview, specifically stated that the upcoming Chevy Bolt would have 300 miles of range. Now, I haven't seen that posted anywhere else. I couldn't find the exact link to the interview. I think it was one of those AI summaries on a search that came up that, oh yeah, Mary Barra said this. Now, one thing I want to say though first is, just because she said it would have 300 miles of range, that does not necessarily mean that it will have 300 miles of EPA combined range, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, even this Chevrolet Bolt EV, when it still had its original 60 kilowatt hour battery pack, I was able to eke out over 300 miles in a single charge on at least one occasion. And driving conservatively with the new 64 kilowatt hour battery pack, 300 miles, even in a sort of daily driving sort of routine, is pretty possible. So it's very easy to get that 300 miles of range, even in real world driving conditions. But to get the EPA rating to match that is a little bit different. So if Mary Barra did say that the new Bolt will have 300 miles of range, then I think that also indicates an increase in range over the previous Bolt EV EUV models, right? So there is implied in that not only an increase in efficiency and or an increase maybe in battery capacity, right? You could look at it either way. So either it's going to get significantly more battery capacity, or it's going to have improved efficiency, or a little bit of both. And this is telling me that my initial sort of prediction of the upcoming 2027 Chevrolet Bolt having as much as a 70 kilowatt hour battery pack, it gives a lot more credence to that prediction, because that would make sense. And in fact, it could be maybe even 75 kilowatt hours, because that would be more in line with a roughly 4 mile per kilowatt hour efficiency, getting 300 miles on a full battery, having 75-ish kilowatt hours of usable capacity. And then this is sort of deviating off that track a little bit, because in the comments of these videos, someone had asked if I could maybe elaborate on what I saw as the charging speed. And it all ties back to, right, that estimated or predicted battery capacity. It also ties back to pack voltage, right? Because that was one of the things that they had asked me to elaborate on, because when we see something like the 85 to 90 kilowatt hour battery pack in the Chevrolet Equinox EV and the Chevrolet Blazer EV, they don't really charge all that well, because those packs are, instead of the 12 module Ultium, I'm just going to call it Ultium battery pack, they're the 10 module battery pack, which means they have a nominal pack voltage of closer to about 300 volts. And so they're already maxing the amperage, the 500 amp max on that CCS1 socket, in combination with a 300 volt nominal pack voltage. It means that they really struggle to see decent charging speeds, right? Whereas you look at that 12 module 100 to 106 kilowatt hour battery pack in the Cadillac Lyriq or in the rear wheel drive Chevrolet Blazer EV, those charge significantly better, and that's because they have closer to 350 volt nominal plus the 500 amp current, right? And so now all of a sudden you're hitting those 180 plus kilowatt charging speeds. So that nominal pack voltage will matter, but then also the charging amperage will matter. If we can assume, based on Mary Barra's comments, that it's a 300-mile battery and it's going to be closer to 75 kilowatt hours of LFP, that means my assumption of it being a 108 cells or cell groups in series is also probably more likely. Usually you're going to see denominations of 12. Again, LFP's nominal cell voltage is lower than the NMC or NMCA. And so what you end up with is you can put another 12 cells in series and you'll still fall below that 400 volt threshold that it appears that GM's current electric motor family and controllers have as sort of a limit, that upper limit of 400 volts. So you can still get away with significantly more cells in series with LFP. But yeah, based on that comment then from Mary, I would expect it to maybe be 108S, which would give it a pack voltage, a nominal pack voltage of 345. I think I had done the math on that before, 345 volts. So it would be significantly more. So the 2027 Chevrolet Bolt would have a significantly higher nominal pack voltage than the 85 to 90 kilowatt hour Equinox EV. So just on the voltage alone, it will have a higher amount. But then again, this is the thing that I keep harping on, and maybe it's, post-traumatic charging from the Chevrolet Bolt EV, but whenever your charging rate maxes out the rated current for the input socket, right? So in the Chevrolet Bolt EV, it was 150 amps on the CCS1. With the Equinox, it's 500 amps on the CCS1. Whenever your charging rate into the battery maxes out your charging sockets rating, that has a whole bunch of negative downstream impacts. It means that if you run battery conditioning and climate conditioning while you're charging, it impacts the charging speed, right? So you're reducing your peak charging speed to allow for more overhead from the charger to go to those other systems. But then it also requires, in the case of the Equinox EV, for you to find a 500 amp CCS1 charger, which isn't always available. And so the other advantage that the 2027 Chevrolet Bolt would have, and this is an assumption based on them not doing anything crazy like a 4C or a 5C or 6C charging rate. The other advantage that it would have is with, say, like a 210 to 220 amp hour battery pack, if it's even charging at a 2C charging rate, that means any charger that can provide 400 to 450 amps is going to be maxing out the charging rate. But more importantly, as long as that NACS or J3400 input socket is rated for 500 amps or more likely 600 amps, it means that the new Bolt will be able to pull additional power from the charger to run battery conditioning and cabin conditioning without scavenging power from the battery, right? From the charging the battery. So you won't be sacrificing charging speed just to keep the cabin cool and to keep the battery cool. So those are where the advantages will come in. And if it is a 75 kilowatt hour battery pack and it can charge at 2C, which seems very likely, then we're looking at the 2027 Chevrolet Bolt charging at close to 150 kilowatt. And then, of course, like I said, with LFP, the difference is, generally speaking, whatever the C rate of the cells is, you're going to be able to maintain them for at least 50% of the charging profile. So you should have more consistent charging for longer. And that's why I said I still kind of anticipate worst case scenario, the new Chevy Bolt charging to 80% in probably around 25 minutes, but doing so very consistently. So, like I said, if anyone can send a link to that Mary Barra interview, wherever it happens to be or wherever it was posted, that would be helpful. Because, like I said, the 300 miles might be a loaded thing until it's an EPA, official EPA range. I'm not going to trust it. It might just be, okay, we're seeing this in daily driving. But to be fair, GM tends to be conservative on that sort of thing. And then the other thing is, like I said, if it is that large of a capacity, we could be looking at a very significant improvement to charging speed. I guess worst case scenario is it's a 1C charging rate. In that case, you're looking at charging at around 75 kilowatt in a 75 kilowatt hour battery pack. You know, good news is you'll be close to maxing out the charging rate even on a 200 amp charger. So the 100 kilowatt rated chargers. Bad news is it's only 1C. But good news is, compared to the outgoing Chevrolet Bolt EV EUV, it would be likely to maintain that 75 kilowatt for most of the charging session. And so even though it's only charging at 1C, charging from 10% to 80% might only take 40 minutes or 45 minutes. So that's what I would anticipate as the absolute worst case scenario, is that these are 1C LFP batteries, and you're only charging at 75 kilowatt, and it takes you 40 minutes to charge to 80%. Not great, but again, that's, I think, worst case scenario. And like I said, you also have to realize that at that point, you know, you've added 200 plus miles of driving range in under 40 minutes. For an older Bolt EV owner, that's a significant improvement. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about is that perhaps I was wrong on this, and I received some pushback on this as well. But with my assumption that the new Chevrolet Bolt will be built on the BEV3 platform, and I understand the logic in that pushback, right? And because GM did say, hey, this is going to be a mild refresh. It's not going to be anything significant. We're just going to basically be upgrading some of the components. And while I get that that could indicate, hey, we're going to keep the same chassis and we're just going to retrofit some components, the only reason I can't foresee that happening is they have BEV3 already as a chassis, right? And I get that they have the tooling and everything ready on the assembly line from when they were last building the Bolt EV and EUV. But at the same time, they still need to put those assembly lines together in Fairfax. They're no longer sharing an assembly line with the Sonic Gamma 2 platform, right? So my understanding is Fairfax, they're still building the internal combustion Equinox, but I don't think that they're going to be sharing assembly lines, not like they were with the Chevy Sonic. And so they don't need to be wedded to that BEV2 platform. And then the other thing is too, like I said, my understanding was moving forward, Android Automotive OS, Super Cruise capability, Global B, all of those, you know, GM VIP, all of those are table stakes moving forward. Just to just to get onto the assembly line as an EV, my understanding moving forward with GM is all of those things would be implemented. And we did see Super Cruise in the Bolt EUV as an option. And normally Super Cruise was, limited to the BEV3 platform, but they were able to sort of shoehorn in a very limited version of Super Cruise into the 2020. Well, I know it was in the 2023 Chevrolet Bolt EUV, maybe all the EUV models, but they were able to get it in a very limited capacity without the updates. Even at the time that I drove it and tested it, didn't have all the same maps that the Cadillac Lyriq had at the time, right? So it was a very limited version, no over-the-air updates, clearly not Android Automotive OS. And so my assumption still is that rather than dive back into the parts bin and start reconstructing motors that they were partnering with LG on, battery packs that they were partnering with LG on, BMS systems and infotainment systems that they were partnering with LG on, GM is just going to move all of this stuff in-house. And in order to do that, or the easiest way to do that, is to use the BEV3 platform. Now, they can still put all of the body paneling and all of the other parts that they were using, interior parts from the last generation Bolt EV EUV, and fit those into or mate them to a BEV3 chassis. But my expectation is that it's just going to be simpler. I mean, remember, there are a lot of older Bolt EVs and EUVs that still never had their batteries replaced. They were recycling battery cases, they were pulling the cells out and repopulating battery cases, and then they just basically ran out of stock. And so they had to go from a hardware correction to a software correction. And that indicates to me that they would have a hard time sourcing, manufacturing the old battery packs, which would be the only reason to stick with that old BEV2 chassis. Like I said, especially if the plan is to implement all of the things with Global B, Super Cruise, over-the-air updates, Android Automotive OS. So I don't know, like maybe I'm wrong on this. Maybe the savings of sticking to BEV2 outweighs any of those other benefits, but I just can't see it, right? If they went through the trouble of updating to the J3400 NACS charging port, how are they not going to also update things like the underlying chassis? And remember too, there's a lot of benefits that come with it. The wireless BMS, the reduced wiring. I have to imagine now that they are mass producing the Chevrolet Equinox EV, BEV3 platform, they're moving to production of the Cadillac Optiq and Lyriq BEV3 platform, right? The Blazer EV BEV3 platform. Just having so many different vehicles on that chassis just makes it, to me, make more sense for them to transition the Bolt EV to that. And maybe I'm, like I said, maybe I'm wrong on this. Maybe it's a more significant overhaul and retrofit than just starting with a BEV3 chassis and then migrating as much of the former Bolt EV or EUV to that new chassis as possible. Maybe that's more work than just retrofitting the BEV2. Like I said, if it were that easy to put Global B and all of these other features into BEV2, I would have expected that they would have done that by the 2022-2023 model years for the old Bolt EV EUV. So I don't know. Let me know what you think. Do you think it's possible, or would we even want to, if they did do some weird hybrid thing like that, would it even be worth just referring to it as like a BEV 2.5 or something? BEV2 V2. In some ways, it's much ado about nothing, but also I think it's a really big indicator in terms of the feature set, and also I think it's a big indicator in terms of the actual production volume and price that we can expect. Because I think, maybe, again, maybe I'm wrong on this, but I would assume that going to BEV3 would actually save GM a significant amount of money that would then be passed on to the consumer. Again, and maybe that's just an assumption. Like I said, I'd love to hear what you think. Do you think, I mean, when it comes to the BEV2, do you think I'm off base? Do you think they're just going to stick to that? Or do you think it's more likely that they retrofit the older Bolt EV EUV body and paneling and interior and whatnot, and mold it into a BEV3 platform? At which point, like I said, I would also expect them to ditch the 150 kilowatt motor that they built in conjunction with LG. I would see them ditching that in favor of, again, their now mass produced, formerly Ultium motors that come in those different configurations. I think with the 180 kilowatt permanent magnet, I think 225 kilowatt permanent magnet, and then a 62 kilowatt induction. I would just see them sticking to those off the shelf, ready to implement motor controllers that they basically are now mass producing for the rest of their EV lineup. So anyway, I'd love to hear your take on it. Like I said, hey, if Mary says it's a 300-mile Bolt, then I'm not going to argue with her. And then, like I said, I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are of how they're going to do the assembly line in Fairfax, and whether they're going to retrofit BEV2 or, update it with BEV3. And then hopefully these plug side chats can be something other than Bolt updates and predictions. Thank you for watching.